Okay. Hi, everybody. We should be broadcasting. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone joining us for today's webinar on creative material development. We're going to dive right in. We have got a lot to cover in this hour, and we always like to make sure we leave time at the end to answer your questions. This is Meg Sansevero with Marketing for Change speaking, and I'm going to cover a few simple housekeeping items first. So as everybody's joining as a participant, you should have your microphone on mute by default. Please take a moment to just double check that it is muted, and we thank you for doing that. Second, as I said, we are planning for time at the end of the webinar to answer questions. If you do have a question for today's presenter, please type it into the box labeled Q&A at the bottom of your screen. So that's the Q&A box for presenter questions. If you'd like to share something with the group, like a resource or just chat internally, there is a chat window as well. And if today's presenter prompts you to interact during the session, you can go ahead and use the chat window for that. And finally, this webinar is being recorded, so you will have access to that recording afterwards, even if you can't join today. So after the webinar, a link to that recording will be available with a group of handouts via email. Okay. And today marks the fourth of 6 webinars that we're holding this year as part of the first ever Amplify series. This series is designed to help health officials increase their capacity to effectively communicate the public health impacts of climate change and help our communities prepare and respond. It's led by behavior change communication experts at Marketing for Change and supported through a cooperative agreement with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's Climate and Health Program. And we want to thank that team for making this opportunity available, and to all of the Climate Ready states and cities grantees and their partners who I know are listening today. We're also especially grateful to the grantees who lead the communications community of practice for their support in bringing this to life. All right, and without further ado, I want to introduce today's speaker. Today we're joined by Karen Ong. Karen's the creative director at Marketing for Change. She took the helm of the creative team at Marketing for Change in 2010, building and growing a team of designers, copywriters, videographers, and developers that focus not just on creating solid creative executions, but executions that move the needle on behavior change. She's rooted with a background of design and sociology. Karen is known for bringing empathy for the target audience, a sense of humor, and a push to embrace the unlikely approach to all of her work. Karen has led projects and won numerous Addies and other awards for clients such as the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the Horizon Foundation, the Florida Department of Health, and the City of Santa Monica, to name a few. All right.
Thanks,
and with
everyone.
that, I'll introduce Karen. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Meg, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for joining today. This is Karen. As Meg said, I'm currently the creative director at Marketing for Change and have been since 2010. I joined the firm a few years prior to that as an art director position. Just to give a bit of a background, I've been in the creative industry for a number of years now. Depends on how far back you want to go. I did actually used to run an art camp out of my basement with my sister for some neighborhood kids, but starting off, I actually wanted to be a photojournalist. I was totally inspired that, pictures and exposing people to different visual elements could help change the way people see the world and make the world a better place. About 6 months or so into my formal education on that in college, I realized that was not necessarily the path for me. The structure of that type of career was not going to be a good fit for my personality. And a teacher at the time introduced me to the world of graphic design, and I fell in love with the power of the visual elements and how important that is to how people understand information, how it influences what people do and how they interpret and feel at the world around them. And so with that, I started working, for many years just as an actual graphic designer and got really fed up with the industry. I was designing and doing work for things I didn't care about and I didn't think were all that important. Anything from branding pajama companies to creating, flyers that would go unseen or unused by the target audience. And it was about that time that I stumbled upon this world of behavior change marketing, which is what we call it now. And the firm at Marketing for Change in about 2010 is when I joined, as I noted, as the art director there. And from there, just a few years later, I started leading as the creative director, which means, I'm not doing any hands-on design work anymore, but really leading the full team of designers, copywriters, everything from digital to video, influencing where we do media buys, where people are seeing the space. So it's with all that, that almost decade of experience that I'm excited to share with you today what a lot of the lessons I've learned that I think can be really helpful for all the important work that you guys are doing every day. What we're actually going to cover today then is, overall talking about how to infuse a strategy into the creative work you're doing, overcoming that, if you've ever stared at a blank screen or a blank page, it happens to all of us. What do? How do you start? And how do you start in a way that's going to set you up for success at the end, as opposed to just filling that page? Tapping into some behavioral determinants. We're going to touch lightly on that. As a company of Marketing for Change, we're studying behavioral economics, behavioral sciences all the time. So I want to give you a real light touch on that and some resources for if you want to dive into that deeper. I'll share a few examples with you, so we're not just talking about this in a high level place, but so you can see how it's actually been applied to some work that us and others have been working on. And importantly, how to know when a creative idea isn't working. It's really easy, especially in the creative space. If you get into it, you're having a lot of fun, things might be looking and working and feeling great, and you're excited about it. But at the end, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for your target audience. So before we dive into that content, we're going to do a quick poll that'll help me make sure that we're giving you the best information that helps you in the type of role that you're playing currently in creative development.
Poll is launched. Almost at 50%. Love everybody to vote. Okay, we'll give you 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. Get your votes in. 2, 1. Okay, looks like they've stopped coming in.
All right, great. I was excited to see this. So it looks like 63% of you are actually collaborating with designers and writers. There's a good handful, a little less than 50% of you guys that are doing it all yourself, kind of working from that in-house space. And then a small handful of you are just interested in the process. So that's great. Thank you. Okay. First, we're going to talk about where to start when tackling a creative project. So what do you think of when you think of the word creative? As we just saw from the poll, some of you guys are working as creatives doing the work. Some are partnering with others to get that work done. Some of you guys are, simply just trying to learn the process. But oftentimes that word creative scares people a little bit. You hear a lot, oh, I'm not the creative type, or I'm not a creative person. That's you. That's so-and-so. A lot of times people are thinking of this word, art. I hear a lot, oh, I'm not the artsy one. People bucket that as something, it feels very intimidating, maybe having flashbacks, to the classes in elementary school where you're forced to paint or create something out of clay. It can be really overwhelming for people that don't feel like they have that creative gene in their blood. And I want to introduce another concept, which is design. So how is this different from art? Designers come in all different, shapes, sizes, things that they're focusing on. But the way I like to think about this a lot is in the terms of between design and art, that design a lot of the times is about your audience. So if you're designing something, you're designing it for a specific person, for a specific use in a specific place to be used. Whereas art, and the reason why that's so intimidating for so many people, is that usually art is an expression of yourself. You have to feel something, you're maybe making a statement on something in particular, but you have to be sharing something personal about yourself. Whereas design doesn't have that piece into it, and you really can be more formulaic in how you start approaching that process of designing something. So where do you start? This is a really scary place to be, right? A totally blank page. What do? You've got to come up with a campaign or something, or maybe you need to create a brochure or a poster or social media post that you want to be visual. You know, everybody knows that people respond more to videos and imagery and content these days. So, but what do? You've got a blank page. How do you even begin tackling that fear of what to put down on paper? So we're going to talk about 3 different things that you can start keeping in the back of your mind that anytime you're presented with that blank page, you can dive into. The first is knowing who you're talking to. The second is what you actually want them to do. And the third is knowing where you're talking to them. It sounds a bit obvious, but it's easier than you think to start overlooking these things when you feel like you're tasked with being creative. Because like I said, all these people are coming at you like, oh, you're the fun one that does all this cool stuff. And it's going to be colorful and it's going to be bright and it's going to be entertaining. And so you can easily get distracted by trying to focus there, as opposed to really grounding yourself and thinking about the audience and where they are, what might appeal to them, what's going to drive their behavior and what you actually want them to do, and knowing that the space, both physically and mentally, of where you're actually talking to them makes such a big difference. We're going to dive into each of these in detail. So first, knowing who you're talking to. The trick here is that this cannot be everyone or the general public, which I'm sure is a very common thing in the world that we're all living in. You want to affect everybody. The problem is, if you want to actually start creating change and impacting people, if you target everybody, the problem is you really risk not resonating with anybody at all. And so you need to be specific. You need to talk to people that feels authentic to them. And so when you open up an audience where you're talking too widely to the entire, US population, or globally, or even smaller, just everybody in the state of Washington or wherever you are, you really risk having that go on deaf ears, because nobody really feels like that message is for them. So if you're not familiar with this movie, this is the famous John Hughes movie of The Breakfast Club. So if you haven't seen it recently, go home and stream it. It's a good one. But I use this as an example to point out how different even the audiences of a high school student is. So let's say you want to target a high school student to be more physically active. Think about how different each of these characters will react to different messages. Are you talking to a student who has problems with authority and is rarely going to show up for class? Or are you going to talk to the straight A student who has problems connecting socially and might have more social anxiety? So that's a barrier they might have to joining any kind of physical activity, club or sports or anything like that. So the messages that you're going to get to them, you want to really tailor it to each of your audiences. So it can be really, how do you do that? You have to think about somebody else as opposed to thinking about what you want them to do. We use what we call a persona, and this is commonly used throughout different communications techniques. And one of the worksheets we're going to follow up with after this webinar is this persona handout. We do this in workshops a lot, where you can see there's been a picture taped on. You actually give a face to the person, you give them a name. We won't have the little pictures for you to cut out. There will be a blank space. So I encourage you, if you use these personas in your work, to cut people out from magazines, print them out, draw somebody, but give them a face. You give them an actual name. And this should be based, this shouldn't be building a stereotype of a person, but based really on the knowledge that you have of this audience. If it's a totally unfamiliar audience to you, bringing in audience experts, people that know this audience, potentially tapping some resources, existing research about that audience. And then a best case scenario, you might be able to get, have the actual audience themselves help inform these personas. So you can really build empathy with that audience. The way these are set up is that you start writing a likely situation from them. And the likely situation has nothing to do with what you want them to do. It's all about, their daily lives. You'll see this next section goes into pain points. What are the things that are causing them problems? Because that's a really good opening to, if you can solve one of their problems, which also gets the behavior you want, it's a win-win for both you and your audience. And keep in mind here, most of your audiences are not thinking about what you're thinking about. Their mind is in a million different places. Maybe they're realizing that their spouse's birthday is coming up and they're trying to figure out what to get him or her. They've got this long list of to-dos. I was on a call just yesterday, I think, and one person was distracted by the fact that they forgot to take their trash out, and the other that was trying to walk their dog. So not only are people not thinking about what you're not thinking about, they're distracted by their everyday life. Layer all their work on top of that, of what they're focused on every day and the work that they do and all of their worries. And then a reminder I like to give everybody too is that it's 2019. So not only do our brains look like this, but they also look like this. There's constant messaging that's coming in from all different pings, notifications, all over the place, that's both in real life and in digital format. And so breaking through that clutter is really, really hard. And so thinking through all of the messaging and all the things that you're creating, trying to put yourself in that person's shoes is going to give you that upper hand of being able to break through this clutter. We advise all of our clients to focus on one audience per material, which can be really tricky. It doesn't mean you can't target multiple audiences in a campaign, but having different materials that are tailored to different audiences. So this is another worksheet that you're going to be getting as a follow-up. What it is this chart where you can start listing all of your audiences. So what you want to do is, okay, here's a couple different audiences that I might want to target. Let me think through where they fall. Are they a high impact audience as far as what I'm trying to do and the change I'm trying to make? Or are they going to be lower impact for that change? And then are they going to be easy for me to reach them? Do I already have an email list for all of them? Can I walk outside my door and grab them? Are they already coming to me, maybe visiting a clinic I'm involved in? Do I have access to them in that space? Or are they harder to reach? Do I not even know how to get in touch with them and would have to do a lot of legwork to figure out how to even get these materials in front of them? Once you have that all mapped out, then everybody that's on the higher scale of this easy to reach and high impact is where you want to focus, because that's where your efforts, it's not, we don't unfortunately have endless time and energy in the day. And so you want to spend that in the space where you're going to be able to be most impactful. And one reminder before I move on from the audience section is sometimes you're not always talking to the primary audience whose behavior you want to change. I'm going to awkwardly try and use a sports reference here, which for anybody who knows me is not something that I usually will do. But I know enough about football to know that the quarterback is not usually the one scoring the goal. They're typically throwing the ball to a wide receiver who will actually make that score. So think of that as, your quarterback might be somebody, let's say, for example, you're trying to reach low-income moms, but you're not actually specifically talking to low-income moms because you want an authentic and credible source to be the one handing over that information. So maybe you're giving an employee at a community clinic to provide the materials. So in that case, you need to think through that stream, think through who that pass-through audience is to get to the final impact that you want to have on the target audience whose behavior you actually want to be changing. Now we're going to cover what you actually want them to do. You've totally mastered at this point who you want to talk to. You've put them down on your chart. You've circled, the audiences that you're going to focus on. So now that you have your audience, what is it that you exactly want them to do? Not shockingly, have a call to action. This sounds extremely simple, but you would be surprised. And when I say have a call to action, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the call to action for the end, big behavioral goal, but from a brochure to a website to a social post, is there something you actually want them to do with this information? From clicking something to making a phone call to telling somebody else about it, what is the actual action that you want them to take? I'm going to show you a couple examples here. So take a look at this. Okay, so I just gave you 15 seconds, which is actually more time than most materials are given by any target audience. People are pretty quick to look at something, see if it's relevant for them, and either toss it aside or move on. So what are you supposed to do after seeing this? This was actually a campaign, I think it's still up running now. It ran in my neighborhood, and it drove me nuts because I'm the type of person that actually, I do care about food safety, and I am interested in how to keep my food safer, keep it lasting longer, and also making sure I'm not poisoning myself in the meantime or making my stomach upset by any means. But the clean, separate, cook, and chill just doesn't say anything. It doesn't give me anything to actually act on. The only thing that's giving me here to act on is the URL, but that's a little bit of a barrier to get to the audience, to get to the behavior you want, because then you're asking people to pull up a phone or their laptop and actually type this in and assume that they can find the information they're looking for, as opposed to giving them a particular call to action. One more I have for you, so take a look at this. Okay, so again, what are you gonna do? What is this creative, this billboard that you just drove by asking you to do? So one thing to remember is this is a billboard, so you're seeing it probably pretty quickly. And that's interaction is very similar to even scrolling through a social media feed. So more digital content, or even a brochure that you might be handed, or a piece of mail that you get where you quickly are filtering it. You have a very quick amount of time to understand and get a takeaway. So this one, to me, I've shown this in a couple different group settings where people are just always have this squinted eye look on their face. So I'm imagining all of you now with that similar look of, wait, maybe it's about this, or maybe it's about that. Maybe it's about trash. Maybe it's about dog poop. Maybe, I'm not sure. And nobody's ever entirely clear. And I don't actually have the answer to what this is actually getting you to do, but the thing I like about this example is, as a person who sat in a lot of meetings where people are trying to be creative, quote unquote, I could see how something like this would emerge, where the big idea here is, if you didn't get it already, Gus here, this guy, is dressed, he's a personification of your lawn. So kind of like those, when Apple came out with those ads a long time ago where you had I'm a Mac and I'm a PC, that was the start of a lot of people personifying different things and products. And so the big idea here, I'm sure, oh, that's a great idea. Yeah, we're going to have a personification of a lawn, and he's going to tell you what to do. His name will be Gus. And you get to the end of it, you set up this photo shoot, you create this sweet grass wig for him and beard, and then you completely forget that the call to action here is so muddy and unclear that this piece of creative is going to be really hard to actually get anybody to change behavior. Stating the obvious a bit, but calls to action must be actionable. So think about the easier you can make that action for your audience. You could have a call to action that maybe there's an actual barrier to the audience doing that. We had something in a workshop once where it required people to get in a car, and the audience was actually saying, well, I don't have access to transportation. I can't do that. So are there things that are problems that are standing in the way of your audience and that behavior that they're asking to do, that call to action? And can you remove those or reposition your call to action to work in a space where the audience can actually act on it? So all this being said, I like to contradict myself a bit. of saying, definitely have a call to action, but not too many calls to action. This is another space where a lot of times you're working with a cause or an organization. Of course, we all want everybody to do everything, all these things, but choice overload and analysis paralysis are real things. And if you give someone too many options or too many things to do, it will actually result in less people doing that behavior. This picture always gives me anxiety. I'm the one that doesn't like going to big grocery stores because there's too much stuff and too many things to sort through. And remember from earlier, our brains look like this. So they're constantly on overload. There's constant distractions, constant things coming up. So the easier and the more you can boil down a call to action, the better. Let me give you a couple examples of this. Here's an example of a report from the American Academy of Pediatrics on safe infant sleeping environments. So I don't even think this is all the pages of it. I'm not positive on that, but it's pretty dense. It's a lot to take in, especially for, think of a new mom who's not exactly, gonna have the time to sit down and read and digest, even have the brain space or the ability to stay awake to read a document like this. So we worked with this client and we boiled it down to one key behavior: babies being put to bed in their own clutter-free space. And so that message is in here, it's in the text, but on top of that, we're also showing the behavior in the photo and the visuals that we're using. We had in the photo that we're using, we had a video showing a similar format of this, where we're actually showing them the space, we're showing them how to do it, and on top of that, we're also empathizing with what moms want by saying it might not be pretty, but it can be peaceful. That's very empathetic to where a mom with a newborn or a small infant at home is going to be, as opposed to assuming that they're going to be able to read some long, dense document about all the ways to do it. Let's give them a little bit of help to get the behavior we want them to do by starting with where they are and giving them information in a place that makes them easy to do the behavior. One more example here. This is a 17-page document on how to fertilize your lawn in a Florida-friendly way. It includes very simple things such as testing your soil and other things like that. So I don't know how many of you know homeowners who would actually sit down, read a guide like this, and then go through all the steps 1 through 5, cover all 17 pages and do everything from the beginning to end. My guess is it's a pretty small number. Maybe even if somebody's motivated at the beginning, maybe they start dropping off by about step 2. So we worked on this campaign, and instead, again, we simplified to one simple behavior: skip the fertilizer this summer. So we'd worked with the client to figure out, where the highest impact and the behavior would be, and empathize with the audience to see which of those behaviors would be most likely for them to do. Shockingly, it didn't end up being testing their soil, but we were able to encourage people to be Floridian, go out, have fun, take the summer off, enjoy a nice time, and enjoy the bay. And by the same term, we're actually protecting it by not fertilizing it. Take a look at this execution. What's the call to action here? So we have one simple call to action, you'll see. Just highlighted it, call 211. We purposely didn't include multiple ways to get in touch, such as multiple phone numbers or a phone number and a URL. Because I don't know if you've ever gotten this before where you've got a business card and it's got 5 different ways to call somebody. It puts a little bit of a jolt of, oh, where do I even start? And it can seem to add up frustration even at that first step. One last one, and this may look familiar to you. This is from the CDC Social Media Toolkit for Communicating the Health Effects of Climate Change. I believe someone from my team is posting a link for this if you haven't seen it, but this is some work that we're doing. And notice the call to action here. All right, I'm going to highlight it. Right in the text there, we say check on your older neighbors in the social post. It's one thing to let people know that older adults can be at higher risk. That's great. You're raising awareness about that issue, but just everybody being aware of that issue doesn't actually do anything. So by including this call to action of checking on your older neighbors throughout severe weather events, that's giving them something to do. Similarly to choosing an audience, this is another worksheet that you'll be getting, is to focus on these priority actions. The same thought process. Think about, okay, you've got your target audience, you've got, long list of all the things that you could potentially want them to do. Start mapping them on this document. Is it high impact? Is it low impact? Is it easy to do? And when I say easy to do, is it easier for the audience to do? Thinking about, are there barriers that are in front of them? What kind of complications could there be? So is it easy for the audience to do? Or is it hard for them to do? And again, anything in that top left corner of easy to do and high impact is where you should start as far as narrowing down that call to action. All right, finally, the third option, the third thing you need to remember is knowing where you are talking to them. For starters, that means the physical space. So where physically are they? Are they walking through a downtown street and scrolling through their social media feed where maybe they see a video you've created? Or are they at home watching a reality TV show, socializing with their friends where it comes on and a traditional 30-second ad buy? Each of these interactions is going to be very different. The former means you need to grab them quickly, maybe not be reliant on sound because they don't have earbuds in necessarily. Whereas the latter is you maybe have more chances to engage, build a story, you have more of a dedicated viewing space. In addition to knowing what the physical space is, you want to know who or what is actually delivering that message. So this can be a pretty wide range of things from, working with, a media buy team, or maybe you're doing it yourself, deciding where that's going to be placed, or maybe it's a brochure that you're going to position in a certain spot of, in a place where the audience is going to come in and see it. But it also is the who of who's actually delivering it. Remembering that quarterback analogy that I made earlier, it might be that you have a healthcare provider. So look at this list. It could be a healthcare provider, it could be news reporters that are actually delivering the message, maybe health departments, social media accounts, or their website that's giving it. And the key thing to think through here, what you want is somebody who is a trusted and authentic source for your audience. So sometimes that might be you and the organizations you're working for, in which case that is great. We've often also partnered though with other people, maybe there's, different community organizations, different churches, different things like that, where they already have a trusted relationship with the audience that you're going to seek. So knowing that the message comes that way through that source is going to be more impactful for that audience. And then also think through who that should actually be. Are there opportunities maybe to create a message that is more powerful because it's from a surprising or a different audience? I'm going to use this example. What I've got on screen here is what we called our complimentary floss. So it's complimentary because it's free, and it's also complimentary because the little floss things give you a compliment saying how nice you look today. And of course they take credit for being the floss, because the big thing for the campaign here was connecting oral health with overall health. So this floss exists, right? It was a clever, creative idea, but where we actually place that, where people get this floss, makes a difference. The idea for this was not to provide it to traditional places like a dentist's office where you would expect to see floss and get that message. We partnered with the YMCA and doctors' offices to have them distribute this floss, so that those places where, the YMCA, it's physical health, things that they're already thinking about as kind of more overall health and not necessarily thinking about how oral health affects that. And similarly for doctors' offices, you're going in to get your physical, not to get your dental cleanup, and making that connection to how your oral health does actually impact your overall health and how it's all part of that. So just a challenge to think about, not just the traditional means of getting information across, but are there also opportunities for you to partner with somebody to get the message through that's going to only reinforce the behavior that you want. Another thing to think about is where they have actually heard your message before. So what's the mental space that they're in, not just the physical space that they're in. Rarely do you have somebody on either end of the spectrum. So if somebody, they're not going to be a total blank slate and have never heard anything having to do with climate change or clean water or the environment or tree planting or anything like that. And they're not probably totally bought into whatever message you're working on. Their average audience is right somewhere on the spectrum in the middle, where they've heard things maybe from different organizations. They may even confuse them for your organization. And so you've got to take that into effect or into account when you're planning your messaging and where their mental space might already be about a certain issue that you're talking about. Top 3 things, so next time you find yourself staring at the blank page or blank screen and not really knowing where to start, or maybe, there's a high percentage of you guys that are partnering and working with designers and developers of, asking these 3 questions, having a discussion about it with those copywriters, with those designers, with the developers, whoever is doing the work, so that you can all be talking about the same thing. Write them down, post them up. We often, have documents on projects we're working on to make sure it's everybody on the project knows exactly that, who you're talking to, what we're trying to get them to do, and where we're talking to them for any particular deliverable. And it's so easy once you get into the weeds of starting to develop things, you can lose sight of that and get lost in a concept. I'm going to shift gears a little bit here to talking about behavioral determinants. So you guys are now pros at this point. You know how to conquer the blank page. You know the things that you need to do to build a solid foundation for your creative work. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the things that drive people to change their behavior. A very common approach to creative is really let's just tell them something. If we tell them something and raise their awareness about a particular issue, they're certainly going to do that thing, right? It's a really important thing. I think it's important. They're going to think it's important too. And that's just this magical thinking that I'm here to point out and unfortunately burst that bubble. I think, yes, it would make all of our jobs a lot easier if people would just do what they were told to do. But I'm sure many of you in the jobs that you're working on know that that just isn't true. And certainly anybody with, let's say, spouses, kids, dogs, cats, or anything like that, probably especially know that that's true, that not everybody's going to do something just because you tell them to do it. So we have what we call our different behavioral determinants, and we have a handful of them that we take a look at and see what's going to move the needle for this type of person on behavior change. And the biggest thing I want to point out here, the big key takeaway here is that knowledge is really only a small part of the picture. In fact, the Daniel Kahneman, if you guys are familiar with him, he's a Nobel Prize winning psychologist. He actually says that it's only 5% of decision making that's rational, which leaves the entire other 95% to kind of non-conscious and intuitive or emotional thinking. And so what are all these other factors here? You've probably seen a little bit of them on the screen, but down in the bottom right, like take a look at norms. Norms is one where, if everybody else is doing something, then you want to feel like you're doing it too. Even on a conference call, if everybody has their video on and you're the only one without it, maybe you turn yours on or maybe you turn yours off. Or if everybody's in a room and everybody's standing up, but you want to sit down, you might stand up a little bit longer to see if everybody else is going to sit down. Things like cost, emotion, feeling, are there risks and rewards to these things? We talked a little bit about skills and confidence that I hinted at earlier. How easy can you make it for somebody to do something? Do they actually have the skills to do it? Physically, and then you can see this little line coming off his brain. Do they have the confidence to do it? Because sometimes maybe they can actually do it, but they're not confident enough to do it. So I'm going to show you a few examples. Take a look at this ad. And take a look at this ad. Both are phone ads promoting their camera, but they tap into different behavioral determinants. This one is telling you it's 41 megapixels, so it's using that knowledge piece to tell you that. This one is using emotion, so you see the image and you have a response to that, whether it's, oh, I think that's a beautiful picture, that's lovely, I wish I could take a photo like that, or I wish I could travel and do that. It's a good dynamic between knowledge and emotion. One more is an example of a hotel trying to get guests to not have their towels and sheets washed every day. Take a look here and see what they do. I'm gonna highlight here a couple things that stood out to me here. This was actually in my hotel bathroom when I was staying in Chicago once. It says most of the Witty's the hotel, travelers who stay in this room reuse their towels at least once during their stay. That most language is setting up a norm. So it's telling you that most people like you are doing this. Don't you want to be one of them too? And then looking at easy at the bottom, I've called out here that in order to actually do the behavior that the hotel wants you to do, you have to actually physically pick up this card and move it to the bed. So that means if you do absolutely nothing, if your target audience, the hotel's target audience of its guests, are do absolutely nothing, they get the behavior you want. And it doesn't get much easier than that. One last example here. This is one of our campaigns. It was a campaign out in San Jose. We wanted to bring neighborhoods that didn't otherwise have access to healthy foods. And the key thing I want to point out here, as far as what we were thinking going through this, is that we knew that people didn't like the word healthy. They weren't focused on that. So while this was a campaign about bringing healthy food, instead of saying healthy, the campaign is good to go, fast, fun, fresh. I said that totally wrong. Fun, fast, fresh. We're using emotion and reward. We're not using the knowledge of it being healthy, and we're using the environmental space. We're putting these carts. The intention was to put these carts in spaces where it was on the way home from something. It was in convenient spots where you wouldn't have to go out of your way to get it, so it was already on your pathway home. Okay, so now that we've gone through and covered a lot of the theory on a lot of this, I want to take you through a few different campaign examples to show you how different approaches can be. Let's say the behavior we want is to get people to plant a tree. Here's a pretty typical approach. So the problem here is that this is only really going to attract people who are actively looking to plant a tree, and those numbers are probably fairly small. The action here that we're asking is for people to save a planet, save the planet, and that's a pretty big task. What we did instead was we created this campaign. Instead of appealing to the folks that want to plant a tree, those people were already planting trees through that other traditional messaging. We partnered with different community organizations to put on events. In this case, this was a skate park. People didn't come to plant a tree because they wanted to plant a tree. They came because they were a skater. It was part of what we call a self-standard. So do they see themselves as that type of person? And they wanted to be around others in their group. The other people were doing it. It was really about improving the skate park more than it was about the behavior of planting a tree. At the end of the day, they were planting a tree, which is what we wanted them to do. So how we got them there was just a little bit of a different pathway. Getting help for depression, let's say that's the behavior you're working on. I'm going to show you an example here. This is a typical approach, specifically targeting firefighters. Firefighters are actually more likely to die by suicide than in the line of duty. So it's a big issue for a lot of firefighting organizations. So if you take a look on what they're doing here is what we often call is restating a myth. So by saying it's a weakness for you to reach out and seek help, you're actually in effect telling people that it is a weakness, even though you're saying it's not. Here's the creative that we worked on. So there's going to be sound here. It's a video. So it was a little loud during test. So just a heads up for folks. I think I turned it down, but take a look at this execution. So see the difference here. You can probably pinpoint it, but we did a shift where instead of saying you aren't weak, we're saying be there for your crew, which in essence, we knew that many of firefighters joined because they cared about their community that they wanted to serve, and they cared about their crew, and it wasn't for themselves. So by making the messages all about helping other people, in essence, it still tells them that it's okay if you need help, but that's not the direct message we're calling out. We're telling them, coming to them where they are and telling them to help other people. Last one, exercise. Everybody's favorite behavior, right? Here's a pretty typical approach for an exercise class ad. Look at this guy, he's kind of intimidating. This might be an okay ad for somebody who's already exercising, is just shopping for different ways to do it, maybe shopping for a class that fits them best, but it's not really gonna reach people that aren't seeking exercise already. So that's exactly what the challenge we had when we ran this campaign. This was actually a CDC-funded campaign in Pinellas County, Florida. We ended up calling it Find the Fun. And we set up Pinellas County as the capital of fun. We had ads that were running. We had these billboards that had different spaces for different fun things to do around, the map on the right is a bus stop ad, and it actually showed where you are here, and here's things within walking distance. We had an online tool, which is what you're seeing on the left, that helps people find things based on location, time of day, and things like that. So we make it easier. The trick is it's all active fun. So we have that in here, actively fun ideas, which is another way to get exercise, but that's not what the audience was looking for. They were looking for ways to have fun with their family. So we're answering that and getting the behavior we want in the creative. All right, so I'm gonna quickly go through two last things of knowing when ideas work and doing creative testing, and then make sure we've got a little bit of time for questions at the end here. So knowing when ideas work. Like I said at the beginning, you've come up with this perfect creative idea. You're really excited about it. Remember maybe Gus the lawn guy, somebody was really excited about that idea. So how do you know if it's gonna work or not? You've always gotta apply this creative, apply this strategic filter. It's really tempting to say, oh, that's a cool idea, but it can often cloud you from seeing if it will be effective or not. So there's many great art directors and creative directors out there. They might be winning even big awards. Maybe all this stuff is winning awards, so it's reinforcing the fact that it's great. But just because it's visually stunning or making you actually laugh out loud because it's so funny doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be strategic. So what do I mean by strategic? This should look fairly familiar. All three things we identified in the first section of this webinar. Does it speak to that target audience that you identified? Does it impact that behavior you want to change? And does it work well in the space you want to see it? Again, having those three things listed, using it at the beginning when you're concepting, and then using it to do a check at the end. So finally, you also can do a creative test, and you can do it on a budget. We often do this, and we do it on large scales and small scales, depending on the project and what the impact is going to be. But don't be intimidated by thinking, oh, I can't do creative testing because that's going to be this big exercise that's expensive and it takes a lot of time. There's definitely some simple things you can do. Remember I noted earlier about Daniel Kahneman and the 95% of decisions that are made on intuitive, non-conscious, emotional thinking. Why I'm bringing that back up here is because this has a strong impact on research implications. If you ask people these direct logical questions, it can often lead to misleading results because people aren't very good at explaining what they would actually do in any actual behavior that they would have when seeing a piece of material. So the one thing I want you to remember, the big takeaway from this section is just remove this question, do you like this, from your vocabulary, just completely. When you're asking people about something you've created that you want to have an impact on behavior, instead you want to ask the right questions to the right people. And so the right people are people that are like the target audience you're targeting. So ideally you could actually get somebody that's in that target audience, but it's also somebody that knows that target audience that's similar to them. Maybe they're just in a different location or something like that. So make sure to get people that are similar to your target audience, and then the right questions, right? That's what are those? There's 5 questions I'm going to give you. We have a worksheet at the end that will be sent to you where you have all of these, so you can take them out with you when you go out. They are, what are your immediate impressions? What comes to mind first? What grabs your attention? That's really going to help you identify the breakthrough potential. So is somebody actually even going to notice this? Even if they were to pick it up and say, oh, I like this, you just force them to pick it up. So then they say they liked it. But in the real world, would it actually break through? What's the main point and what's it trying to tell you is another good question to ask. And what that's going to do is figure out if there's any unintended messages coming through. The third would be, how does it make you feel? What does it remind you of? What does it make you think? And that's going to help you understand any kind of emotional reaction that the user might be having to that material. The fourth question, who do you think this is for? How relevant is it for you personally? Why or why not? And this is important because even, again, if they answer the other questions well, they think it might, that, again, they could easily say that they like it. But if this material doesn't feel like it's actually for them, then that's going to be a problem when you actually roll this out, if it feels like it's for a completely different audience and not for them. And the last one would be, what seems to be missing, what's unclear, what could be a problem, and that's going to help you flag any unintentional problems with the creative. So again, you get all of that in a worksheet, so you can take that out and use that. In summary, before I hand this over for questions and open it up, remember the three things: who you're talking to, what you want them to do, and where you are talking to them. And that's both physically and mentally where you're talking to them. And don't just tell people what you want them to know. I opened up a little bit of behavioral determinants section in here. If you look at the very bottom of the screen, funeasypopular.com is the blog that we're constantly posting what we're learning and seeing about how people, about behavioral implications. So feel free to dive deeper into that. But the big takeaway is start with people where they are, not with what you want them to do. And then just being really, really comfortable having thick skin for you and your creative team of knowing when you have to throw out good ideas. We throw out good ideas all the time that look beautiful, are completely entertaining, but they're just not going to be strategic. So with that, I think we can open it up to questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen. We are nearing the top of the hour, so if you know you need to leave at 2 p.m. Eastern, please go ahead and type your questions in ASAP so we can get to those first. Obviously, there's a recording, so if you need to go back, you'll have that as well. And Karen very nicely put her email there. So we can stay a few minutes over as long as there are questions. That's totally fine, but let us know what's resonating with you, where are you stuck, anything that's not making sense, any thoughts you want to share in your own experiences and collaborating with creatives. Please do go ahead and type that in the Q&A. And I also want to thank Karen for throwing out many of my non-strategic ideas over the years. She's been a great mentor to me in that. So yeah, it really is helpful to have that person. Okay, I'm not seeing any yet. If folks are there, we can ask a couple of our own questions while we're waiting for those to come in. So Karen, for the people who answered at the beginning that they're a little bit more the DIYers when it comes to this kind of stuff, they may not have access to a designer or a team of creatives, but they need to do outreach, say, or create flyers, do things on social media. Are there any tools or resources that you would recommend them using?
Yeah, for sure. And this is, so keep in mind, so I have the luxury of having a wonderful creative team that works for me. So they work in the very traditional Adobe Creative Suite is still the most popular suite to be using. But for a lot of folks, I know that's really intimidating, if you don't know how to use them, because there's just so many options there. One that we actually use internally is Canva, is a great one, CANVA. That's a great one to look up for they have really nice templates, especially for creating things like social posts. There's a lot you can do on that will look very nice and pulled together professionally without having to have the more in-depth tools or having a designer, as Meg said, that can do that for you. As far as video editing, there's tons of options these days. Meg and I were actually just doing a presentation to an environmental group on video work themselves, and a lot of people had really great resources, both from, I think YouTube has its own editor that you can use, and some of the social media platforms do as well, but even on your phone, there's a lot of apps that these days you can get a lot of just simple editing done, and especially if you're looking to do something where you're posting it on social, that's more than enough bandwidth to do it. You're not trying to piece together a perfect, highly produced 30-second spot. In that case, you probably want to bring in a professional that's using the professional software, but there's lots of great tools out there, and I'd encourage those if you're in the chat to go ahead and post some of your comments or things and tools that you're using, because there's a lot of great things out there these days.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, Canva, what that does for me, helps me with straight lines, right? And I don't have design software. It's amazing. Yep. Okay, here's a question from Alicia. So, tips for nuancing regional differences. I work in rural areas and struggle with the balance of flashiness, which isn't trusted and looking current. Any suggested resources to guide this? That's a really good question. So It's like a cultural regional difference.
Yeah, I think even the fact that you're asking that question means you're on the right path, which is, sure, maybe, being flashy and new or feeling current, that doesn't always mean that it's the right approach. There's no reason that you always have to have all your materials feel that way. So if your audience is going to be turned off by that or feel like it's going to turn them off, I would encourage you to look at other resources of materials that they are interacting with. Are there certain websites that they're going to, or materials that they're reading, magazines that they're reading, and what does that look like? What does that feel? Because what you want to get at is what feels authentic to them. And sometimes that might actually even mean it's less designed, right? Or less, cleaned up. And when I say design, I mean, kind of pixel perfect, everything's in the right spot. The typography maybe cost you a handful of money and you've got nice photos. We did a project once that was targeting a low income audience. And I actually had to talk to one of our designers who had taken an image that he was using, and it looked like what I called a J. Crew baby, which wasn't exactly going to resonate with this audience. It was too perfect, too put together. It looked too expensive, just the photo. And so we ended up using some wonderful real photography, which maybe from a photographic standard wasn't the highest, but it was the what was going to resonate with that audience and feel really authentic to them.
Yeah, and agree. That's great that you recognize that, Alicia. That's a really amazing insight. And like Karen said, it isn't always about being that pixel perfect all the time if it's not going to resonate. So yeah, good question. So thanks. You're welcome. All right. Again, top of the hour, but we'll stay on. If there are more questions, go ahead and type them into the Q&A, and we'll do our best to answer your question. Karen, I have another one. So when we're talking about where people are going to see this, I think about questions I get around, well, like how often they see this, right? And how much should they see this? It's like how many times is too many or too little, or too many to the point where an audience hears the message and they start tuning out.
Yeah, that's a good question. One that we're constantly thinking about, especially as we're thinking about the placement and, working with our media buy team or working with people who are posting. So there's no real magical number, so I'm not going to give you any like a hard number here, but what I would say is that people do need to see your message a few times. They need to feel like this is, something that's familiar to them in many ways a lot of the times. So you need to build that up. But that said, I would also encourage you, if you are just pushing the same message, maybe you've been doing it for 6 months and you don't see any change, you don't see anything happening, then that's a good time to reevaluate your actual message. Because it could be that if you're getting to your target audience, you're getting them in the space that they're in, but they're just not hearing it or reacting to it, you might want to adjust that message to see if you can change that. And there's certain spaces where you can actually play around with that. So especially places online, on social media, you can post different things. You could do what's called an A/B test of, you post the same thing with one message, you post the other with another message, and you can actually track and see via the data what kind of engagement you get on one message versus another, which is really nice. So no magical number there, but I would say you don't want to fall in either extreme. You don't want to assume that people can hear your message once and they're just going to magically jump in and do everything that you want them to do. But you want them to see it a few times, get that familiarity with them, that familiar with you as a brand. That's the other thing, that person that's bringing you the information. If that's a familiar source, then you may need less times than if you're introducing a brand new brand or concept. But then be really cautious if you're like totally convinced it's the perfect message, the audience is seeing and hearing it and nothing's happening, and it's been a couple months or so, then you definitely want to try and take a look and see maybe where you can tweak the actual creative and the message to make that more impactful for people.
Got it. Thank you. We've got another submitted question. This is from anonymous attendee. I do social media for my local public health agency. We cover so many issues. Yep, get that. Diseases, restaurant inspections, healthy behaviors, policy, etc. I feel it's hard to have a coherent voice. Any thoughts? I know CDC has different accounts for STDs, etc., but we don't have the bandwidth to do multiple channels yet. Yeah, I definitely get that. Yep.
Yeah, and so I guess covering lots of different topics like that, if you're posting it to your own social media and you know that you do actually have a following where you're grabbing all of those audiences, I think it's okay to post frequently and to post things, because even though some people may see one thing that doesn't really resonate with them and then post something else that would resonate with that with a particular audience. What I would caution against is trying to create the perfect social media post that appeals to all of them, right? So you're trying to cover too many topics in one posting, and really think about, maybe you're posting actually more frequently, but with a wider variety of what those topics are and what those who the audience really is and what you're asking them to do. And one thing, you might already be a pro at this, but if you creating a content calendar for yourself so that you're mapping that out and you can actually schedule it, organize it, and plan it ahead of time, that'll help you think through, okay, we've got some content for audience on this day, let's make sure we post something again for them, a few days later as well, so that feels cohesive.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in here as well that, that's a really good point of, sometimes we still assume like everybody who follows us is going to see what we post on social media all the time, right? And I think, most of us who are on those different channels these days realize that's just not the case anymore, that, maybe we see 1 out of 5 posts from a page we follow in particular, especially compared to our friends and our personal contacts. So there's just not as much danger there of people actually even realizing that you're posting about different things, right? Mm-hmm. And the other thing that I'll offer is my guess is that a local public health agency has quite a few organizational and partner followers who might be wanting to share or get information from your account that's going to be helpful to the people that they serve. Mm-hmm. So in that way, like the fact that you have diverse content is really great. And you are an authority, clearly, local, that is your local agency for public health. So, thinking about your audience maybe in that way and what they would be, what they are really looking for. And it may be not as much of an issue that it is diverse topically.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Okay. All right, I don't see any more questions in the queue. So with that, we can wrap things up. And I just want to tell folks what's coming next. So our next webinar is going to be on June 20th. It's Ally Acquisition with our own Strategy and Planning Director, Sarah Isaac. If you have not registered already, please keep an eye out for that email reminder. There will also be a registration link in the follow-up email. Yep, you will get that then, as well as the handouts if you have not seen those already, and the recording, which you can feel free to share. So thanks so much for staying on with us, and thank you, Karen.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.